The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
All right.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I am Tylor, who is excited to finally get to the part of this book that makes me love this book, not just the really dark parts. And I am joined by Greg, who probably gave me quite the look when I said that before I clarified. Greg, how are things?
Oh, man, I had a rough time going to soccer practice today. I pulled up to a stoplight, and what do I see but a mom with a toddler young woman on a leash, a child. And I was like, how dare you? No judgment to parenting styles. I just had this week's chapters on my mind, and I was angry at the existence of child leashes. But obviously, I mainly kid. I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Things are pretty good. I am now done with the semester, so I am free and clear. Everything is looking solid. And honestly, last 5 weeks of this book is a really exciting place to be. I think it's pretty clear, especially after the beginning of what we start with this week, that we are building towards something. And I suggest we just dive right in, because we actually do have some ill-advised discussion of visual media in a non-visual podcast to power us through. This is going to be the image in chapter 40, Damane, which is the image of the collar and bracelet linked together by a single thread, what is known as the Adam. And as usual, I would like you to take a first stab at any further visual description and thoughts about the image before I give any other descriptions.
It's a really interesting one. I saw it on my read and I was like, oh, we're going to have a visual discussion this week because I've never seen this one before. And, then reading the chapter, it became very obvious what the image is in terms of the actual object, not necessarily where it gets shown. But as I look at the image, it's clearly the Adam and the collar of the two. But what's most striking to me about it is the actual leash part, the part from the collar to the wristband. And why it's interesting to me is it very much evokes, I should say figure 8 because of how it's positioned, but it really made me think of infinity more than anything. The way it kind of loops around through the center of the frame and through there. And it's interesting because this isn't an infinite thing, and it doesn't really work like that. Why you would change this kind of design to invoke that symbolism, I'm not entirely sure, other than the fact that it looks very cool. And in particular, to note that the two rings are very white. Actually, the entire device is white on a black background, which doesn't seem to fit with how I was thinking of this device in the chapter. But I in terms of artistic detail, I do like the shading on the inside of the ring. That kind of denotes where you're looking at the interior of the device. I just think that's a cool little bit of detail. And that's all I got.
Yeah, and I think there are a couple of things kind of building off of what you said that I have. So the first is you were talking about that kind of like figure 8 or infinity symbol. That I think immediately keys to me. We've seen that symbol before. This is one of the symbols of the Aes Sedai. They have the snake eating its own tail, and that is also in the shape of that infinity. So I think that might be evoking something about female channelers, which makes sense given what this object is and does. The other thing is you were talking about the coloring and how the Adam is obviously depicted almost exclusively in white, other than the shading that you described. But I think that that effect you described of the kind of infinity symbol with the leash actually creates kind of an illusion also of like darkness being contained within the Adam.
Mm.
It almost encircles it. And I think that it works really well as an image because even though the Adam is very white, it's still an image that evokes that kind of like very stark, dark, and light. And it doesn't entirely feel like it is kind of without darkness in it because of the way that it's arranged in kind of the frame. So I think it works really well as an image, kind of you could see it either as an image that the Sean Chan would look at and think of it as like, oh, the Adam, the wonderful thing. But you can also look at it as we probably do, and it evokes a good bit of darkness. I think that kind of duality to it works very effectively for me.
Yeah, and I just want to echo what you said. There is a visual element where it does seem to create kind of almost a black disc within the leash, and it's kind of jarring that the frame comes back inside of that.
Yeah.
That it's mainly breaking out of the frame, but the frame on the top and the bottom is visible, overlapping with it, and so it's kind of like, oh, I don't like that it's broken, but yeah, I think there's not much more to say about light and dark that we haven't said in previous
Yeah,
discussions,
totally.
but it is notable that the art designer here is again playing with those themes and our representations of them.
Yeah, and the last thing we usually talk about with these visuals is what do they symbolize when they show up in a chapter. This one is pretty straightforward, literal. It's an object in the world. When it appears, it probably means we'll be dealing with Seldom and Damane and Adams and all of the made up words that are related to this object. So nothing too special, but do keep an eye out for it because I think it'll show up a few more times this book. And then I think it for the most part becomes relatively rare, but when you see it, it really keys you in to what you are about to experience. So I think then we probably dive straight into the chapter 40, Damane, in which you weren't probably prepared for exactly what was going to happen, as was Egwene. She and the girls emerge out of the Waygate, led by Leandrin, and very quickly they realize there are a lot of other people there. They describe about 50 armed people, as well as what we know as being Seldom and a few Damane, and as also a few nobles. Egwene asks Leandrin if she knows these people and what's going on. Leandrin completely ignores the girls and starts talking to someone called the High Lady Suroth, and it becomes clear that they both share a leader or a master, and they are trying to avoid kind of getting angry or that making that master angry. Abruptly, lots of things seem to happen at once. There's a commotion and some wind, and then Egwene is in an Adam. She punches someone and feels pain in basically the same spot where she punched the person, and then things settle down a short time later. Egwene is still leashed, Min is injured, and there is no sign of either Elaine or Nynaeve. A person wearing the other end of the Adam, Rena, explains what has happened. Egwene has been made into a Damane. She is now essentially a slave whose channeling can be controlled by a Seldom, whoever is wearing the bracelet attached to her collar. And she is punished repeatedly throughout the chapter mentally. Pain can be given through an Adam. And as we learn later on in the chapter, channeling can be kind of detected through the Adam. At one point, Egwene is instructed to channel at something, and she doesn't try, and Rena immediately knows. Throughout the chapter, it quickly becomes apparent that Nynaeve and Elaine are still loose, and there is thunder and lightning in the distance, likely channeling between them and the Damane. Eventually, they are all of the soldiers are recalled and the Damane are brought back. Neither Elaine nor Nynaeve has been captured, and the group starts to leave. Initially, there is a plan to kill Min, but when Egwene begs for her to be spared, she is more or less told that she can continue to be alive, more or less, as long as Egwene participates, and then she'll be able to visit Egwene occasionally, and that will be, the thing that is held over Egwene's head until she learns all of the rules. And we end the chapter with a brief Nynaeve POV in which her and Elaine reunite after running away for a while and realize they need to get to Falme. But as far as I can tell, not a whole lot else happens in that section of the chapter. So I kind of see this as where we switch from being in kind of setting up the pieces and getting things where they need to be to immediate climax, 0 to 60, nothing in between. Was that effective for you? What did you think about this chapter where I think a whole lot happens, but you could also kind of describe this chapter as Egwene gets captured, everyone else escapes, and you might not be entirely wrong.
Yeah, it was certainly shocking. And I'm not thinking of a good comparison at the moment, but there are so many movies where like the heroes have a clear plan, we're doing the clear plan, and then it's just like snap, one wrong thing and everything goes wrong. And this
Yeah.
this felt like one of those moments. I actually maybe like Harry Potter returning with Cedric's body or something. It's
Mm.
like, oh, your mirthful world of childhood is now over. Congratulations, Hogwarts children.
Yeah.
Um, and so it felt very much like that, like, oh, this just got very real that Egwene is immediately in danger. By way of preliminary comments, I'll also just say that what came immediately to mind to me was our discussion in the last episode about the time frame and how
Yeah.
I hadn't necessarily pieced together that this was earlier than where we had seen Rand land. And so in my mind, I was immediately like, oh, expletive. This is going to be months of
Yeah.
suffering. This isn't just like even in the best case scenario. Well, I guess I did think Nynaeve could immediately rescue her, but when that became clear it wasn't happening in this chapter, I was like, oh, I feel like best case scenario is a couple months here.
Yeah.
And thinking about how damaged Egwene will be by 2 months was really jarring and upsetting. And so I guess, yes, it felt like playtime is over. You are in a war now.
Yeah. And I think that something that Robert Jordan does really effectively here, and I guess I'm kind of talking about the end of the chapter at the beginning, but I think that's often kind of what we do is like everything generally. I want to kind of applaud Robert Jordan's restraint because I think there are two ways that he could go with this, right? One is let's now stay in Egwene's head for a while. And two is what he ends up doing, which is next chapter, let's go to something else. And
Mm-hmm.
I I really feel maybe I'm wrong about this, but George R. Martin spent 2.5 books torturing what would eventually become known as Reek. Boy,
Mm.
am I kind of glad we skip at least a little bit of that with Egwene, right? We seem to jump into Rand's head, and presumably that means we are back into that time frame of what we were talking about last time, like you said, maybe a month and a half, 2 months later. Um, I think that is actually a sign of a good writer sometimes is to leave the
Mm.
implications to the reader and then not show them all right away. It works really effectively from my perspective. It, as you say, it kind of lets you fill in the gaps in a way that is as bad as you kind of want it to be. It's the old horror trope, I guess I'm saying. The shark is much
Yeah.
scarier when you don't see it.
Oh, that's exactly what I was going to say, is that it's so much scarier not to see the monster than to see what it looks like. So, yeah, and it's pretty, I mean, it's hard to say this without it coming across as misogynist in some ways, but the fact that it's Egwene, like Matt's been suffering for a long time,
Yeah.
but now that it's Egwene who in this story has, not been perfect, but has been a beacon of light and hope and
Yeah.
happiness, particularly because we experienced so much of her through Rand. I think we're kind of colored by
Yeah.
the kind of dream of the good life we could have had being shepherds, with a happy wife. Well, that dream turned out poorly. Like I know, we saw that reality too, but that it just felt like yes, and now because it's her, it's really upsetting in some ways. So, um, I mean, I think then if we take that out of the table, it seemed like the main point of this chapter was really just to establish the Adam and the rules by which it is governed and kind of immediately show us how hopeless this is
Yeah.
from the inside, certainly.
Exactly. And I think that this is, to me, why I really like this chapter is because it's the big plot twist chapter that works really well, but it's also very much a world building chapter, as you're saying. And a lot of the things that I have to talk about today are not like what happened and how did it go down and what's coming next. It's much more, as you're saying, what are the rules and what do we think are the gaps in them, right? Because I think whenever I see a main character get trapped in a predicament like this, I immediately go into Sherlock Holmes mode. I want to look for what are the clues and the hints and the things that are eventually going to get this person out of the dilemma. And so I think it's really smart for Robert Jordan to almost info dump everything you would ever want to know about the Adam right up front, because it gives you all sorts of potential clues and hooks to get lost in as he's eventually building what I think we assume will either be at the end of this book or maybe even later, an attempt to get Egwene out of this collar, hopefully.
Yeah.
Um, the first thing that I think is maybe something that is worth noting here, if we're kind of starting to think about what are the gaps in the armor, what are the things that could be weaknesses, is I think we see very early on that the command structure of the Shan-Chan, something's a little bit odd here. Liandrin and Suroth's interaction raised a lot of eyebrows for me. And so while this obviously is prior to Egwene getting into the Adam, I think one thing that we might be looking at is who is in charge of what and who is running things, because it sure seems like later on in the chapter, we get a lot of like, I'm ignoring that because it's not my problem. And so figuring out what are the gaps and who knows what and who is doing what might be important. What was your takeaway from kind of all of the depictions of, I think it's kind of our first look at Shan-Chan hierarchy other than just Turok is at the top. What was your takeaway from all of these interactions?
Yeah, so I was still stuck, as I talked about in the kind of multiverse chapter a couple chapters ago, like trying to figure out who's the bigger threat and what's the order of operations I've said. So what I took from that is that at this particular moment, Liandrin and Lady Suroth have been tasked with taking these pieces off the board. These dealing with what should be two women, not a group, which is part of the problem. And what was striking to me is it was not one of these two working for the other. It was both of them working for the presumably the Dark One, Baalzamon, and it was clear at one point that Liandrin was like, he's picked you for now, but could pick somebody else. So to me, what was that meant is just that the Shan-Chan are a major threat to what Baalzamon is planning. So he is using his powers to try to undermine them, to try to knock them out, in order to continue with his domination of the continent. And so found the weak link in the Shan-Chan, which is just somebody who could be manipulated, who's this lady. Then the interplay between the two was very fun because both are like, yeah, just wait till you're a little less in favor and I'll take you out. But we have to cooperate at this moment. So maybe then also a key takeaway being that these are not factions that naturally work together, that they are not in cahoots. They're not the Uruk-hai goblins and what are the normal ones? Orcs. Yeah. They're not the Uruk-hai and the orcs. They are in fact really different factions that are trying to figure out their relationship.
Yeah, and I thought this was especially interesting from my perspective for Liandrin, because Suroth is obviously kind of a new character. We don't exactly know where she fits in the Shan-Chan hierarchy, but Liandrin seems to be relatively prominent and important among the Aes Sedai. She is, if not on Moraine's level, at least relatively close, and we've learned that Moraine is pretty high up in the ranks, all told. So I think the fact that we're learning Liandrin is not necessarily the highest of the high rungs, I think that's interesting from my perspective, right? We might have thought of Liandrin as like a big boss type, and maybe she's only like a little boss type. The other thing, and I think you're exactly right, I just get like middle management vibes from this section, right? Like two people who really don't have that much power arguing about the little bit of power they have and which one of them has more. And I think it just worked really effectively of like two people sparring who don't really have any influence over each other, but like they communicate with the same dude above. And so like I can get you in trouble is basically the only card they have with each other. Um, I
Yeah, I was
thought,
trying to come up with the Office parallel. So it'd be like Dwight versus Andy. Not
yeah,
we're not involving Michael Scott. We're doing Dwight versus Andy, but they both care, so it can't be Jim. Jim
yeah,
is not in
that's
this.
fair.
So I think it has to be Andy and Dwight.
I think you have nailed what I was going for, a very general metaphor. I'm like, nope, that's it. That's you got it. Um, we then get to what I find the most difficult to follow section of the book, which is Egwene being collared and the other girls escaping. I think it's
Mm.
intentionally written as kind of being a, fog of battle. Egwene doesn't follow, so we don't get to follow also. But it's also a section that ends up kind of feeling like it's told in reverse. We kind of start at the end of this scene, basically, after Egwene wakes up from being knocked out and kind of discover what happened afterwards. Um, a lot happens in this section, but obviously the long and short of it is Egwene is collared. Was there anything in either the storytelling or kind of the way that Egwene discovers what has happened to her that you found especially effective or interesting?
I'll just piggyback on what you said. Structurally, it does seem like Robert Jordan is showing us time after time. He's like, I don't want to write a fight scene, and
Yeah,
I'll show you like what happens. And I think I made this reference before. This is how my wife, came to quit Marvel movies, but after a while, she was like I don't care when they're punching each other. I just want to see who walks away. And it's like, yeah, that's all that matters in these
yeah,
moments. And so I think you're right to point out that Robert Jordan's kind of doing that here. He's like, yeah, I could write this all out in detail, but that's not that interesting. What matters is the confinement and the control, and that's
yeah.
where we'll start that story. So I will, and all that is to say I agree with how you described it, and we'll say it took me like I read through like 3 or 4 paragraphs and then I went back and like, wait, what just happened? I don't think I was paying
Yeah.
enough attention, and passed through it a second time to kind of get the details, which I landed largely where you said it. So let's call it a success.
We then arrive basically at the dark, dark, dark section of this chapter,
Mm.
right? My best pop culture comp, if you want to call it that, is 12 Years a Slave, and that is a pretty dark place to begin the conversation. I think the portrayal of Renna is really well done by Robert Jordan. She seems to me a very believable character who you can see how she has a fully formed, well insulated from arguments worldview that I think is believable, even while we are shouting all of the problems we have with it. And then, as you say, I think the cage that Robert Jordan has created here seems pretty airtight at first glance, right? Just the basic description of what Renna has the ability to do relative to what Egwene does. It feels pretty hopeless. I think that's the big takeaway from me, right? It's a page and a half
Yeah.
of despair as you're reading it. It doesn't seem like there's any easy outs. Was that your takeaway as well?
Yeah, and just to articulate some of the basics of it, whatever action they take against the person on the other end is revisited on them twofold,
Yeah,
right? So the punch really hit her twice as hard. It controls her ability to channel and dampens it
yep.
without any permission. And really made it so she could almost not even feel the power. Am I right in that?
Or
Or
at least not touch it. Yeah,
okay. And that's, okay, so we've taken away everything that makes Egwene special and then also limited like just pure physical violence as a part of that.
yeah,
Then you throw on top of that, oh, and I have your friend Min. So if you don't work hard,
yep,
whatever you do, I will just decapitate her was the threat in this immediate moment. And
yep,
so it does seem very hopeless very fast. And I'll echo what I said. Because it's Egwene, it made me extra angry.
yeah.
And apologies if that is a little misogynist.
Well, I think for me, it's not even that because Egwene is a woman. It's because Egwene, for a book and a half, has been like the most excited to be out and free and doing things not in her small town, right? I think
Yeah.
I'm extra angry that it's Egwene, not because we're getting the damsel in distress trope, although I'm mad we're doing that. I think mostly I'm upset because like it's the freest character being put in the least free position, and that just hurts a little bit more. Um, what is then very interesting to me is what you kind of framed this whole section of the chapter around is we then get the history of the Adam and a pretty detailed description of its use and kind of the philosophy around it. I feel like we get a pretty detailed lesson here. The long and short of it is an Aes Sedai created a way to control other Aes Sedai, and surprise, surprise, it was used on her. But there's a lot of kind of it's the kind of detail that I would give to players in a D&D campaign and expect them to only remember 10% of, but whatever 10% it was would be good stuff for them to kind of have and latch on to. And that's what I think is good world building, right? No one remembers all of the details, so all of the details need to be good. What were the 2 or 3 things that stuck out in your mind that you latched onto?
um that it happened across the sea, and it
Mhm.
was actually, I'm gonna mix up the names. I also was listening to a Ringerverse episode the other day and realized I didn't know there were 2 Arthurs in the King Arthur legend. I recommended this podcast, I think. I was like, oh, there's Arthur Pendragon, and then that's the father of, or maybe there's an Uther over the
Oh yeah,
Arthur.
yeah, yeah.
And I didn't know that at all. I was like, this wasn't in Sword in the Stone. What are you doing? What are you talking about? But it did seem to me, so it was it was, again, it was Arthur Hawking, so the person who originally went across the sea,
Yeah.
right? And
Well,
that was
his army went across the sea. He
his army
stayed.
went
Yeah,
across the sea. And that's in that army was where the Aes Sedai was. So it was like a generation ago that the collar was developed, the Adam,
well,
and that it's now a
generations
common
ago. I think we're
generations
a
ago.
thousand a thousand years. We're looking.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, I do, this is exactly how I play D&D. And then and so the fact that it's been around for a long time, that it has to be wielded by a woman.
And a
Um
particular type of woman. We learn that many women will put on the bracelet and absolutely nothing will happen. Only some of them can become Saldam.
and then this was a way to ensure the leadership of that army stayed in control of everything over on that side of the ocean.
Exactly.
Um yes. Well, and that just reminded me that a part of all this moment is also that the plan was to throw Nynaeve and Egwene on a boat and
Yeah.
get
Get them
them
across the
back
ocean.
across the ocean, which doesn't answer your immediate question, but just I was like, oh crap, like that was the plan, and
Yeah.
seems to be what they are headed off to do. Of course, complicated by the fact they only got Egwene and Min
Yeah.
there as well. Um, so those are probably the history moments that stood out to me.
Yeah, the only other one from my perspective that stood out, and this is where I get to call misogyny on myself, is the one thing we learn about men and the Adam, which is that when men put on the Adam, most of the time nothing happens, but every
Mm.
once in a while, both the man and woman die screaming. And if
Oof.
you are like me, I think we've got to assume that those men are men who can channel, or at least
Mm.
could channel. So, um, just interesting world building details sprinkled all throughout it. And I feel like when you're reading an author like Robert Jordan, that is the kind of thing that he's going to say, okay, there's 30 things here, 29 of them are red herrings, but one of them will come back later. And I love that kind of Easter egg hunt. I don't know whether everyone does, but that really appeals to me. The last part of this section of the chapter is just the absolutely chilling Rena being proud of Egwene for being willful, because the willful ones eventually become the best. And I shiver and pass to you.
Mm. Yeah, very dark, and again the threats to Min, that like even if you had some hope that Egwene was going to resist this training. Oh, we haven't mentioned the kind of dog training
Oh
metaphors that
God, yeah.
run throughout, and like she pets her and things like that. So like all of that just is a little more haunting and troubling, and just feels completely hopeless.
Yeah, I mean,
within that.
dehumanization like that just has so many historical parallels. Like, it doesn't
Yeah.
make sense to just list them all, but I think you only need to have read one of them at any point in your life to have this immediately set off all sort of alarm bells in your head, right? It's
Yeah.
I think the reason I don't bring it up is because I assume it is at the forefront of all of our minds. But you're absolutely right. Definitely worth mentioning. This
There's
week,
a again, this is a timeless podcast, but there is a blockbuster out in theaters right now connected to the Marvel universe. The new Guardians movie plays a lot with some of these themes, and so it was interesting reading those metaphors in this particular moment, having seen that. And the other, well, now I'm just going to add one more stupid thing. When I finished reading, I grabbed my phone and opened up Instagram, and I follow we're in Boston area, as we've said before, and I follow Providence Comic Con, and they were sharing that Lisa Rinna got added as a guest, the Days of Our Lives star. But I was like, Rinna, no, like it's not even spelled the same. But my eyes immediately were like, no, get out of here. Don't go to Comic Con. So stupid, but where my mind was when I read this.
yeah, fair enough. Uh, when I am gonna shout like, no, why? What is happening? Is the last like page and a half of this chapter. I think my summary of it is is Elaine and Nynaeve meet in the woods. It doesn't really develop much for the characters for me. And so I'm curious whether you pulled anything else out of it, because I sat down being like, okay, this is a big enough chunk. I'm gonna need to make a section of my notes for it. And then I didn't have one. Was that your perspective as well?
Primarily, I will say my primary reaction was like, "Oh crap! I wanted you to be more in control right now."
Mm,
And neither of them were in control, but I expected more out of Nynaeve, and she showed more leadership. But when actually it's a Harry Potter again. Harry Potter, the film version of Prisoner of Azkaban, has those neat moments where something happens and you're like, "What?" And then you see that it's the time turner,
mm,
and it's almost like there's so long between the moments. You like see the rock Hermione throws again, and you're like, "What? Like, what is that thing? I've seen that before. Like, where is it?"
yeah,
And so when we were getting these hints of like rumbles and thunder and lightning, I was like, "Oh, good. Nynaeve's out there exactly in control, doing what she needs to do to stop this."
yeah,
And so when she's not there, I mean, she's not doing nothing. I'm not trying to diminish her things,
yeah,
but the fact that she's not in control and is spending a lot of her time comforting Elaine. So I'll primarily agree with you there, with that disappointment added to the fact that there's not a lot going on here. And then the other thing I just made a note of is just that Elaine is preoccupied with how cowardly she was, and
mm,
Nynaeve is saying, "No, you did what you had to do." That felt very nicely read into the burden of leadership. She says, "Like my
yeah,
mom has to have another kid immediately. I'm not fit to lead." And that just made me think, "Oh, we're gonna be with Elaine for a long time, and we're gonna get her on that throne." And that's the point of having such emphasis on how bad a leader you'll be, because you have to learn how to become a leader. So, when we met Elaine last book, it was clear she was important, but now I think I left this little moment being like, oh, okay, we're going to be learning a lot more about Elaine as time goes on.
I have nothing to add to what you have to say about Elaine. I think it's just really well said, and anything else I would say would just be a complete spoiler. On the Nynaeve portion, I think you're exactly right to be saying like this could have been the rescue section of the chapter, and it very clearly is not that. But I do want to note one really interesting thing that Nynaeve is doing in this chapter, which is that instead of trying to channel in the way that others have been teaching her, she instead is now trying to learn to control her anger. There's a moment in the chapter where it almost seems like she's losing her edge and she talks herself back into being angry because she knows she can only channel when she's angry. So
Mm.
it's that she is not solving the actual problem of being unable to channel what we might call the normal or correct way, but she's finding workarounds in really interesting ways. So at least like small applause to Nynaeve, even as you're exactly right, drops the ball compared to what we could have expected completely. Any last
Yeah,
thoughts on the chapter?
we found nothing in a hopeless place. Uh, there's just, but again, the crushing blow to my spirits at the end of the chapter was that, like, oh no, this is September.
Yeah.
And especially as we transition into the next chapter and see that it's a Rand chapter, it's like best case scenario seems to be because my guess is that we just keep moving forward from the Rand moment now. And so I'm like, this is where they were for 2 months. All headed to Falme, and we'll see where when we get to meet him again. But that is dark. I mean,
Yeah. Well, and
yeah.
as I was saying earlier, I think it's darker because we fill in those gaps, right? If there were
Yeah.
three more Egwene chapters, it would be dark and terrible and we'd hate it, but then it would be done. There's something about it being unspoken that is just it's
Mm.
worse. And with that, we're not going to talk about the next chapter. It will be unspoken. And no. So, chapter 41, Disagreements. So, Rand is leading his horse through kind of the muddy streets of a small town. He's thinking that it's getting late enough the year that it's going to snow soon. And he's being followed by Uno and Loyal and some of the others who are apparently going through the town and gathering information. He asks if Varen could lessen the rain, and she tells him that if she used that much of the power, it would immediately become apparent to the Shan-Chan, and they wouldn't want anyone tracking them down that way. The city at this point is half deserted. They say that there have been Shan-Chan coming through, and there's descriptions of some of the horrible things they did to reduce any kind of rebellion or any possibility of women who can channel getting away from them. And they basically have a discussion about what is motivating the Shan-Chan and what is causing all of the chaos in the area. And it comes down to they don't know exactly who the armies are or what they're looking for. And Varen seems to suggest that sowing chaos is exactly what the Dark One wants at this moment in time. Eventually, they get back to Ingtar and they start talking a bit about kind of what their plans are. And Ingtar seems kind of despondent that they have not found any sign of the horn in the 3 days that they've been looking. And while everyone else wants to go to Falme, Ingtar suggests that they turn back and find another way of tracking down the horn. Eventually, this leads Rand to reveal that what Fane told him in the letter that Barthanes passed on, that he would attack Emmons Field if Rand did not come to Falme. This creates a bit of a stir among the group. It's not entirely clear what everyone's response is, but Varen basically leaves the choice with Rand, and Rand says he feels something is pulling him to Falme and he is going to go, and the rest of the group seems to kind of reluctantly agree with him, although some of the tension is still there. I don't think it's fully resolved. The group kind of goes to sleep in an abandoned area. Rand lays down and immediately there's Baal Zaman. They have the same fight they have had a million times. There's talk about the time drawing close as opposed to over and over again, so that's a slight difference. Rand says he is not the dragon. Baal Zaman taunts him, and then Rand starts channeling the power and hurling it at Baal Zaman. Baal Zaman is able to fight it off, but says he will draw so much that he's going to kill himself. And when Rand releases the power, Baal Zaman gets one last taunt in and then vanishes, leaving just the banner of the dragon lightly smoking from where Rand was hurling the power at it. This is a move the chess pieces around chapter as far as I'm concerned. A little bit of a catch up from the main characters and some taunting from Baal Zaman, everyone's favorite type of Rand chapter. Was your reaction the same as mine? Slight dismay to get back to normal after so much excitement? Or was there something big that you kind of pulled out?
No, my notes for this chapter are very short. I mean, I think it was also very short. The other was
Yeah.
like 2/3 of our page count here.
Yeah.
So really just the fact that there was so much discord going on. We've joked before the old trope of if people just had a conversation. This was almost like, oh, we're actually just having the
Just having the
conversation,
conversation. Nice.
but it's pretty dull to read. And so there is a lot of discord, but a lot of trust in Rand. Rand has seemingly fully eclipsed Ingtar at this point in the minds of all of this party. I liked the beat where Rand is like, well, I'm gonna just wait. I'm gonna figure it out. Like, I'm not gonna rush into this a little bit, but then does make his decision pretty quickly. So
Yeah.
yeah. Um,
I
I think you're right that we had to have it explained to us that they have figured out all they wanted about the Shan Chan, because we don't want to have to sit through all of those
yeah,
stages of we talked to this villager and this tavern keeper and this and that,
yeah.
and just to get there to get a sense of the destruction that's been wrought and how greatly changed this peninsula is, and then give them a reason to head to Falmey.
Yeah, I
Seems
mentioned
clear.
George R. R. Martin in a negative way earlier, so let me give him some real positive props here. This reminds me of some of my favorite chapters in the Song of Ice and Fire series, which are chapters where our like noble-born, really high characters go through just like the low farms and
Mm,
riverlands and kind of experience the devastation that is being done on these people who really have nothing to do with the causes of the war whatsoever. This sequence kind of reminded me of that a little bit in terms of being able to see what the Shan Chan are doing to the region and how the conflict between the Shan Chan and rebels and we know the White Cloaks is kind of creating all of this devastation that otherwise I think would be very easily missed in a series that mostly takes place kind of within the realms of cities, right? So
mm.
getting outside of that, I think was really effective. But it's 7 or 8 pages of getting me that there's not a whole lot of new information in terms of what our characters are facing in the overall plot. It's just like you say, we kind of sit down and hash it out, even though we had all of the broad strokes ahead of time. um I'm curious what you thought about, to me, the most kind of effective sequence here is learning about how the villagers are talking about the Shan Chan and the way that Hurin reacts when he sees where the Shan Chan like burned someone who resisted them. And it's visceral in a way that worked really effectively for me. Um did that work for you? I guess is all I've got is as far as a question.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I was thinking about as you were talking about those George R. R. Martin chapters, one of the prominent metaphors he uses over and over again is that the low villagers and the farmers get butchered like meat, not
Yeah.
like very literal butchering, like just the churn of meat and humanity that is kind of gristled and awful,
Yeah.
and not gristled. Well, meat is gristled, but grizzly, not
Yes.
I was thinking about meat, so I said gristled. Um, but so in that same way, this kind of very visceral moment stands out as well. That it's
Yeah.
not like it's like these people just kind of fall into the system and they're fine. There's real deep pain and devastation here.
Yeah.
And Hurin's power set is very interesting to me still, that he's like, oh no, it's not the ones we're chasing. It's some other horrendous violence,
Yeah.
but not the one we're chasing. Don't worry about it. I mean, not quite, a little mischaracterized there, but essentially how it felt.
Yeah, it feels like almost like a cartoon bloodhound, right? All of the
Yeah.
different things, all of the trails of scent he's following are different colors, and he's like, no, 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 that's just not the right one, obviously. Um, I think that this brings us to the section that I find most interesting, which is the presentation of Ingtar, because
Mm.
he has deteriorated in what we are told is only 3 days, right? It seems like a few days ago he was still very in charge, very direct. He had a plan, he knew what to do, and he could be kind of talked out of it. Ingtar feels almost unhinged to me in this section
Mm.
of the chapter. He has no alternative. He just doesn't believe that it could possibly be Falme, and he's grasping at whatever straws he can. What is your takeaway on how changed Ingtar seems to be? He seems really shaken compared to where he was earlier. As you mentioned, he almost has ceded a lot of control to Rand, which seems very out of character to him.
Well, and to add to that, the fact that he is of this character set, maybe not the Aes Sedai, but he should be the most used to this stuff because he was
Yeah.
on the front lines. I mean, they were the opposite front lines. And so I take that I think I made this comparison previously because we brought up your wife's favorite character of all time, Grand Admiral Thrawn from
Yeah.
Star Wars, who is so good as a military person, but is baffled by the Force mysticism stuff.
Mhm.
And it's not quite exactly that, but I think Ingtar is used to a world where might makes right. Let's
Yeah.
just hit him with spears and swords. And every new layer of this journey has presented him with more and more stuff that he just can't process. And so
Yeah.
I think that makes it easier to understand him deferring to Rand because he's like, oh, this guy at least understands this stuff. but also just shows that, it makes me worried. Who's oh man, this pull. I think it's Lieutenant Upham in Saving Private Ryan, who's the guy who just freezes and starts crying in the stairs. Like he's a guy who hasn't seen
Okay.
any combat. He gets brought along because he can translate for them,
Yeah.
and just folds in the face of it. And Ingtar as a powerful warrior, but then is just going to fall apart in the face of these kind of incredible challenges. It's good to have as just a reminder that, like, hey, regular humans reading this book, you wouldn't do so hot either. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that too, we've got to remember for us, it's been, several weeks since we read about the what if machine. But for Ingtar, it's been 3 days since he was possibly faced with his repeated death. That's going to break some people.
yeah,
So I think that that's exactly the right read. I think this is a character who is struggling at this moment. And so those are characters I'm always really interested to see if they're at that point going into a seemingly climactic moment. What does that do? Does it rebuild that spine, or is this kind of the moment they fully break? I think that's a really fun place to have a character. Obviously not for them, but for us as a reader. I think
sorry, just in over the transom. It's Corporal Upham, not Lieutenant. I do not know whether I gave him a higher rank or a lower rank, but he is a corporal. So apologies or you're welcome, but he's a corporal.
I think the reason that this section is a little bit of a struggle for me, you kind of described it as like a rehash or kind of going over some things we already know, is because the debate is Falme or not Falme, and everyone at this point is just shouting, of course it's Falme. And it's just hard to read the sit down and hash it out when we know where they're going to end up on it. This conversation, yay or nay? I'm out of questions about things that are pretty straightforward.
It just kind of feels like you had to make it a choice, but I don't really care, right? Yeah, it's a thing in movies all the time and books where it's like, yeah, you have to make it harder for the characters to do what we know they're gonna do, but at the same time, like we all just are waiting for them to make the decision we know they make. So,
well, yeah, and this leads Robert Jordan to make the decision that seemingly he always makes. Let's do a Baal-Zaman dream if the chapter isn't long enough. This one I think is really interesting because it is so similar to things we've seen before, except the wording is all a little bit different. And to me, it feels more urgent from Baal-Zaman. He's talking about the time being near and now is the time and make the choice. And then the other is, of course, Rand channels. And this is a thing we've been keeping an eye on in general in this book, but it's also a really big break from the pattern of deny, 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 don't accept the reality of it that we've seen Rand embracing. What were your thoughts on both the similarities and differences of this Baal-Zaman encounter from the other ones that we've seen so far?
I actually wasn't thinking of those as much as I was thinking of Nynaeve in her test and how, as I recall, she wasn't supposed to be able to channel and they told her not to. And here Rand is not in exactly the same situation, but he's within a dream and like in a different reality, and yet channels there in a way that has effects on this world that he's leaving smoking fingerprints on a chair, as it were. So it felt to me, I read all of that as there's a rule going on here that is either a rule for everybody or an exception to that rule that both Nynaeve and Rand have.
Got it.
And so that's where my mind went to try to piece out how that's going to happen. But
interesting.
Yeah, it was effective, and it is for me. I mean, I've confessed before I don't love dream sequences. It was just like, yep, it's another time. He's taunting him. Move along. Lose Theron. Got it. Go.
Yeah, I think that what was really interesting to me is in this section, Rand denies being the Dragon Reborn and is laughed off. And his kind of last push, the last thing he says before Baal-Zaman leaves is, my name is Rand al'Thor. It seems like this is as much becoming a crisis of identity for Rand as anything else in this confrontation with Baal-Zaman, which is interesting. I don't think Baal-Zaman is pushing him in that direction. It is Rand bringing that to the conflict. But Those are the big differences that I identify here. Otherwise, it's you're going to go to the darkness and why not the light in all of the things we've heard repeatedly. Um, but Rand is definitely saying different things than before. What do you think about that kind of change in where he is at from the beginning of this book to the end now? He definitely seems to be reacting differently in this situation.
It feels like this should be kind of resignation, like I can't escape it, and so they're pulling me back in.
Yeah.
But it actually doesn't feel like that way. Like that's what I would expect, and it feels more affirmative than that,
Mm-hmm.
right? That he's not just being dragged into the decision, he's making the active choice. Oh, I guess I'm in a Potter mood tonight. Dumbledore at the very end. God, I'm just spoiling like one of the best scenes towards the end of that series. But says there's a difference between walking into facing your death with your head held high, and that's kind of what I feel here. Is that emotion
Yeah.
of like, yes, it's imminent doom, it's darkness to come, but the fact that he's choosing to do it instead of just being resigned to it seems to matter.
Yeah.
In a big way. So I'm excited to see where that goes. And you've said before, Rand can be a little wishy-washy. So to just see him making a choice and doing something, it's like, yeah, let's do this, buddy. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, that's the big thing for me is I think that this is a chapter where the chapter is called Disagreements, and Rand, I think, is the person in the middle of a lot of those disagreements, mediating and deciding them between, Ingtar and Varen and all of these things. And then the end of the chapter is him finally doing something, right? It's like you said, I think it's actually admirable earlier in the chapter. Rand is like, give me some time to think about this. I need to figure it out. But here he is decisive and quick, and he risks everything to throw the power at Baelzamon. And I think just the ability to do that is something that I don't know if Rand would have had at the beginning of this book. And so this seems to me to be a really good scene of showing Rand doing something different in a situation we've seen before. And I think the situation we've seen before, because it's been done 20 times instead of 2 times, just it's a little less easy to focus on it. But it's that trick that I think like 20 episodes ago you said you taught all of your students. Just show the main character do something different. That's what Robert
Yeah.
Jordan is doing here. It just gets lost a little bit.
Yeah. There's just so much going on, and
Yeah.
maybe I'll wrap up to say part of all of my dissatisfaction maybe in reading that dream is like, but I cared about what was happening last chapter. But
Yeah.
so I'm going to presume from your attitude that as we kind of leave this chapter, we're really headed into the action and moving to bring these two strands together. And I mean, this chapter also crossed us into the last 100 pages in my book. So I think it's time to do some stuff and to have some stuff happen. So
yeah, we got 4 weeks left. So either this book doesn't end or the ending is coming very, very quickly. Next week, we are going to be reading chapter 42, Fall May, and chapter 43, A Plan. And you don't get a chapter named A Plan without something coming very soon that needed to be planned. I think we are getting to the section of this book that makes me love this book enough that it's not my least favorite. That's really what I've got to endorse it with. But it's some really exciting stuff that I think for a lot of people is when they start to fall in love with the Wheel of Time. So I'm very excited for all of you to get to experience it next week, which for us will be several weeks away. So Greg, this is your love letter to a podcast that we'll be abandoning for several weeks of real time. Take us out of the episode.
What a terrible time for that to be true. I was just thinking that during your first summary tonight, where I'm like, oh, I want to go read this, but if I read this tonight, we're not again, behind the scenes, we're not recording for probably 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, when it ends up being, sometimes scheduling gets in the way, or 2.5. So tough time for us, but there will be no interruption. And we'd love to hear all of you, your thoughts on this book as we start to wrap it up. If you want to find us on our social media, especially on Instagram, I'm very responsive now. Promise, promise. And we're also putting together our plans, and we'll announce those soon. But we'd love to start hearing from people who love the show, or maybe are reading along with us and haven't tried the show, or have previously watched the show, and kind of the differences you experienced in that order versus Tylor, who clearly read these 27 times, got the tattoo, and then watched the show.
Yeah.
And we'll announce all of that stuff and more whenever we get back together. So see you next week through the glass columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.